So I got this big box, came to the lab, a great big box, and everything, and you shook it, you could hear all these things rattling around.
This unboxing is taking place in 1982.
We opened it up, and it was all in pieces, and it had instructions for putting it together.
The person doing the unboxing is Nancy King Reame.
And I'm a nurse PhD.
At the time, Nancy was a researcher who was studying menstruation, which back in the 80s was an emergent and exciting field to be in. But back to the unboxing in the lab.
I hadn't really seen one in action. I'd just seen these diagrams.
Nancy and her team had a job to do, and that was to test tampons for absorbency. And this thing coming out of the box was what the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, used to do just that, test tampons for absorbency. It was called the Syngina.
And the Syngina stands for synthetic vagina. The FDA was kind enough to send me the Syngina. In our lab, we were all women. We called her Sally. We thought this was such a hoot. We've got to enjoy some of this since it seems so ridiculous. So I'm being facetious. This is ridiculous. Basically, what do you think of when you hear that term, Syngina, synthetic vagina? I mean, that conjures up all kinds of crazy images, right? Well, the Syngina looks nothing like that. It looks like an 8th grade science project. You can Google it. It's a bunch of glass bottles and a water bath and tubing. And what flows in is the saline in one end of the glass bottle. And there's a tampon that's inserted into a condom that is supposed to replicate the vagina. And then the water bath is supposed to simulate the pressures against the vagina within this glass bottle. I mean, it's crazy, right? But at body temperature, though, so it's supposed to simulate the physiology of menstruation. And using a chic number 29, which is a size for penis.
Oh, my God.
Condom. Oh, yeah.
In terms of testing, is the Syngina still being used to test tampons?
Yes, that's what's being used. And it's supposed to be. That's the standard. They better be using it in all of the tampon manufacturers' laboratories as well as in the FDA. And that's how we measure absorbency.
This is Overlooked, and I'm Golda Arthur. A lot has changed since 1982, but as it turns out, the way we test tampons for absorbency has not. Nancy King Reame is now Professor Emerita at Columbia University's School of Nursing. Her research into the link between tampons and a condition called toxic shock syndrome, or TSS, which was done over 40 years ago now, is groundbreaking. Toxic shock syndrome killed dozens of women and affected hundreds more in the late 70s and early 80s in the United States. This led to a formal investigation into the safety of tampons through a committee that the Food and Drug Administration assembled. Nancy was on that committee, and her research eventually helped move the needle on tampon safety. Nancy's work led to a new scale for absorbency in tampons that you can still see today printed on the side of every box of tampons. She has some incredible stories to tell, and by the end of this episode, you won't look at a tampon the same way again. Nancy's story of how she got into this work and what she had to push against to do it is coming up after the break. The idea for almost every episode of Overlooked starts the same way, on a walk. For me, walking is thinking. It's where I work things out in my head and start the process of creating an episode or figuring out what story I need to tell about women's health. I am always walking, and I take it seriously, which is why I do it in a really great pair of shoes from a brand called Racin. I'm thrilled to introduce Racin as the sponsor of this episode. These shoes have great arch support, and heel to toe, they fit naturally with my stride. It feels effortless, and it keeps me walking longer. I bought a pair of these shoes myself before this partnership, and I can tell you, at the end of a long day, I'm energized instead of being in pain. That's a big deal because it means I keep walking and those ideas keep coming. So check out the link in the show notes for Raesyn Footwear. That's RAESYN, and use the code OVERLOOKED to get a discount on your next pair. Nancy, welcome to Overlooked, and thank you so much for joining me today. What do you think is the most overlooked aspect of the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is tampons and the link to toxic shock syndrome?
Well, my first reaction is to say, we're finally getting some attention. It's been overlooked for so long, and now finally lots of things are being studied, but there's still so much that has to be done. And in relation to toxic shock syndrome, the thing that drives me crazy is that it's considered such a rare disease, and only about 17 cases per year out of 100,000 women if you apply the CDC's diagnostic criteria. But what is overlooked and what we don't know is how many cases don't meet the formal diagnostic criteria. And so women who have flu-like symptoms with a high fever, vomiting and diarrhea, and happen to be menstruating, how many of those are actually cases of TSS? As a nurse, I'm so pleased that we're talking about this. And I don't mean to over-exaggerate and scare people about toxic shock. It is a lethal disease if it's not caught and treated. But at the same time, we really don't have a good handle on what the actual incidence is in this country or worldwide. That's what's overlooked. The probable cases that don't get recorded and don't get reported to the CDC. They have to be reported by a physician to be counted.
Where does the story of your involvement with TSS and tampon safety actually begin? It goes back pretty far, right?
It does go back. While I had just graduated from my PhD in reproductive physiology, my background is studying the menstrual cycle and hormones and the regulation of the menstrual cycle. And I attended one of the very first meetings of the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research, SMCR. And I was flabbergasted because the majority of people there were women. And this was so unusual because most of the professional medical organizations, they were all men. And as a graduate student, I was always one of the few women in the room. So this was like mind-boggling to me that there were all these women. And it turned out many of the women were psychologists, nurses, not biologists, sociologists, anthropologists, and feminist scholars related to menstruation. That was a whole new world for me. I was a very traditionalist in terms of reproductive science, brought up in the man's world. And at the time, in the 70s, feminist organizations and women's health advocacy groups were just starting out, and Gloria Steinem was everywhere.
Thanks to the spirit of equality in the air and to the work of many of my more foresighted sisters, I no longer accept society's judgment that my group is second class.
People were advocating, and it was a wonderful time to be interested in women's bodies. So this was exciting to me. And I met one other reproductive physiologist who was a woman who actually worked for Kimberly-Clark, who made Kotex.
Kotex just made a new maxi pad and mini pad, and they're better than the brand I used to buy. Because these new Kotex maxis and minis have not one, but 3 adhesive strips. So they stay in place better.
Wisconsin was their world headquarters because it was paper mill country where they manufactured tampons as part of their paper industry. So we got together and she said, well, I really need help. They hired me at Kimberly-Clark to help them develop a artificial menstrual fluid. She said, all the people who work there are men. All of them are paper scientists, and they all start entry-level positions in the menstrual hygiene division.
Okay, wait.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Please do.
I just want to be clear. about what I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying that at this point in time,
Yep.
if you were a man starting out in paper science,
Yes. Paper chemists.
paper chemist, okay, the first thing that they made you do was to work on tampons. And that was considered an entry-level role?
That was entry. And your goal was to work up into other paper products, like graph paper. They made all kinds of paper products.
So you're saying, like, in the pecking order of what was kind of valuable in the paper industry, in the hierarchy, tampons were at the bottom.
Yes.
And you had to get through tampons to get to graph paper.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And she said, and you won't believe how they study the tampons. They did have some clinical studies going on in-house where women volunteers were there to wear some of their products that were already FDA approved. So they, it wasn't just animal models. To study absorbency, they didn't use menstrual fluid ever. They used salt water dyed blue, not red.
This is a kind of delightful and intriguing diversion, and I want to ask about this. I grew up through the 80s and 90s, and whenever I saw an ad on TV for a pad, the liquid was always blue, and I never questioned it.
And even with twice as much liquid, its special lock-away core helps trap wetness better than most pads.
And even after I got my period, and my mother, who's a chemistry teacher, I don't think we ever thought about, why is the liquid blue? And now, of course, all I can think about is, why is the liquid blue?
Well, I think someone must have done a survey or something that the color blue resonates in terms of sterility and cleanliness and those kinds of things. They also used a substance called blue goo, which was a gel-like substance. As they started to realize they needed to use a fluid that was a little more viscous. So it was either salt water or blue goo.
Salt water or blue goo. And I want you to remember this because this detail shows up later in this story. But let's go back to the meeting of the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research, where Nancy met her contact from Kimberly-Clark.
I was interested in menstrual blood anyway. And she said, would you be interested in coming on and helping us? We want to understand more the biochemistry of menstrual blood. We want to know some of the characteristics of menstrual blood. And so this was in the early 80s. This was when toxic shock syndrome was at its peak.
The disease is most common in young women during a menstrual cycle, particularly women who use tampons. But tampons alone are not the cause. Researchers believe TSS starts with a vaginal infection. The tampon scratches the vaginal lining, and that causes infectious bacteria to spread into the bloodstream.
And these were young women, adolescents and young women, mostly who were dying, some postpartum women as well, all linked with this commonality of using tampons.
I barely moved my arms and my legs. They were real weak. And my eyes, they were bloodshot and they had hemorrhages in them. If I looked far away, it was blurry.
Toxic shock syndrome was covered in news reports, and the symptoms were pretty awful.
Sudden high fever, vomiting, diarrhea, fainting or near fainting when standing up, dizziness, and a rash that looks like a sunburn. A woman who suspects she is suffering from toxic shock should remove her tampon and see a doctor immediately. Prompt action is crucial.
The Centers for Disease Control investigated toxic shock syndrome and found that the tampon that was most statistically linked to TSS was a brand called Rely.
It's Rely, a new tampon from Procter & Gamble. It's really different and better. Rely is a major improvement in tampons, so it's a major improvement in feminine protection.
Rely was sold through magazine and TV commercials and direct mail.
First of all, getting tampons in the mail was kind of interesting. And of course, for me, I was like, oh, wow, this is so cool. What can I do with this? So when you actually opened it up out of the applicator, it looked like a tea bag. And inside the tea bag were all these little chips, like styrofoam chips from a styrofoam cup. and this carboxymethylcellulose, which really, just sucked up the menstrual blood. And over time, the tampon itself got bigger and bigger, and more blood was absorbed. And women loved them, and they weren't taking them out. But when they tried to take them out, they found out that they had absorbed all the moisture in their vagina, so it was very difficult to take them out. They were so effective.
Procter & Gamble recalled the Rely brand of tampons in 1980 after the CDC report. As news of TSS spread, the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates tampons, decided to assemble a tampon task force. In order to investigate this further, the task force was made up of representatives from tampon companies and consumer advocates. And one of those advocates was a woman called Esther Reame.
Esther Reame is one of the founders of the organization, the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, who for years, many years, published the book, Our Bodies, Ourselves. It's an icon in women's health. It's the Bible, has been for years. Unfortunately, now, I have to say, the last couple generations aren't nearly as familiar with it. Women could be educated about their bodies. Women could read, research papers. They could use them as arguments to bring to the doctor. And Esther was one of the strongest advocates, eloquent, outspoken.
Esther Reame would go on to become Nancy's mentor in the years that they knew each other. But they first met at the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research.
So yes, I met Esther Reame, and we started talking. And we realized we had so many interests in common.
Esther Reame told Nancy about the work of the Tampon Task Force, which she was already a part of, and invited Nancy to join it.
And the FDA also requested and required that patient representatives be part of this commission or committee to develop these standards for tampon. And we were also supposed to study and come up with safety requirements because there were other issues. They had reports from people. There was shredding of the fibers, and some women couldn't remove the tampons. Some of the applicators were cutting and causing sores, depending on the type of applicator. There were infections.
So Nancy agreed to join the committee as a researcher. The task force met monthly and was made up of representatives from the big tampon companies as well as consumer advocates. No surprise, most of the people in the room were men.
A lot of suits. And me and Esther were the women. I think they tried to treat us like, just don't worry your pretty little head about this and just run along and we'll take care of the science. And as if they had no knowledge about it, if they couldn't relate to it. But there were comments more about how tampons were never going to go out of style because women needed tampons because that was the only thing that could protect them. And that, of course, Esther was not happy about that. And she basically said, actually, this is not an illness. This is not a disease. I don't need a medicine. I think you're thinking of menstruation as an illness. I can just sit here and free bleed if I want, which was a term I had never heard, but I knew what she was talking about. I think they got the message loud and clear. Don't mess with us. You want to see, you don't know what a feminist movement looks like. And the whole vibe of that group and the work of the committee kind of changed. There was more respect.
Yeah, I can just imagine what was going through their minds when she said the words free bleed out loud.
I never heard it before. I remember one meeting where she did bring her newborn and she was breastfeeding at the table and she was very natural about it. It's the best way I can describe it. And men were flabbergasted. The big thing I remember is she said, by the way, you weren't willing to reimburse me for babysitting. And I'm only X weeks postpartum. So I hope you don't mind that I brought my newborn with me and I don't want to miss anything. And please carry on.
Absorbency would turn out to be a crucial element in understanding the link between tampon safety and toxic shock syndrome.
I was appointed to the FDA task force to try to develop some standards for absorbency because as part of the discovery around Rely and the link with toxic shock, The FDA then had to take a closer look at, well, wait a minute, what other tampons are causing this? They were mostly the more absorbent ones. Well, how are we measuring absorbency? Well, there was no real standard. And it turned out that one company's regular was another company's super. A consumer, a woman walking into a drugstore, wouldn't be able to compare. It wasn't like sunscreens where there was a number.
Nancy was to carry out blind testing on these tampons without knowing the brands behind them.
It was proprietary information, trade secrets. So they didn't want to divulge. And we could not get them to talk about ingredients. I didn't even know which brand was which. They were all de-identified.
And then another issue came up, and this takes us back to the blue-dyed salt water.
I was amazed that they were still going to use the blue dyed salt water. And I said, well, wait a minute, why aren't we using menstrual fluid? Oh, well, that's ridiculous, they all said, all the lawyers and all the tampon company representatives around the table. We can't do that. It's going to gunk up the syngina.
Which brought about another challenge.
I mean, they had some legitimate issues because how do you standardize menstrual blood across women, even across the same woman? It changes measurably. It changes pH, it changes viscosity, it changes amount, flow rate, and all those studies I had done prior to doing this absorbency test. So I knew all of that.
So instead, Nancy decided to work with heparinized blood that had no clots in it, which she got from a nearby hospital blood bank. So using the syngina, she tested the tampon samples with two fluids, blood and blue-dyed salt water.
Oh, this is the ultimate piece of information that's overlooked. We showed that as you go up the absorbency scale to the higher and higher absorbencies, the difference becomes pronounced. And by the time you're at the super and higher levels, you're retaining much more blood in the higher absorbency types than you are of the salt water. It's a whole different viscosity. It's a whole different dynamic that goes on. Go in a drugstore today. Go into your bathroom and pick up the package and look on there. Our committee was able to standardize the range and the amounts of fluid that get absorbed based on these absorbencies from light to regular, super plus. But everybody thinks it's menstrual fluid that gets absorbed. No, it's salt water. So in essence, we are underestimating the amount of menstrual blood that these higher absorbent products are absorbing. I can't imagine that that's a good thing.
The results of Nancy's tests on tampon absorbency were given to the FDA, who analyzed the data. It served as a basis for a new absorbency standard, which all tampon manufacturers had to adhere to. Tampon absorbency was now standardized, and that changed the manufacturing process for some companies.
It cost somebody a lot of money because they had to re-engineer all the manufacturing equipment. If you have to downsize a product or upsize. So there was some hostility and competition.
The task force disbanded a few years after it began, but it was not until 1990 that these absorbency standards were released to the public.
Until now, a uniform labeling system that would permit consumers to compare absorbency between different tampon brands did not exist. So, the Super Plus label on this brand and the Super Plus label on this brand did not necessarily mean the same thing. That's changing.
The new labeling that will appear on the tampon box should look something like seen in this chart. There'll be some information about the ranges of absorbency corresponding to each term, so that if a woman picks up a box that is labeled super on the outside, she'll be able to look on the back and determine that that product absorbs between 9 and 12 grams.
Cases of toxic shock syndrome fell dramatically because of this research into absorbency. But Nancy's actual results weren't published because the data was considered proprietary information for the tampon industry.
We were frustrated because this information wasn't coming out and our work on the synthetic menstrual fluid wasn't coming out. So we wrote a letter to the editor, to JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, and we basically summarized after the absorbency standard was released by the FDA, we had by the way, what you're reading here is not menstrual fluid. So at least we got something out in the public about the nature of this labeling standard and what it did or did not really represent. And the trade secrets that was always the excuse. It was proprietary information. It's still being used as an excuse for why they're not releasing ingredients. Even today, even though we now have finally in New York State a law that says you must list intentional ingredients on the product. And they're kind of skirting that issue. They're putting things like ink or plastic, just stuff, kind of generic terms, like dumbed down terms rather than specific chemicals that they are introducing as part of the manufacturing process.
So you're saying that even today, if I can just cut in for a second, even today, we don't actually know what goes into a tampon?
No. Now, companies are kind of having to get shamed into putting something about ingredients on their boxes, but only intentional ingredients. That doesn't include all the unintentional ingredients that get perhaps contaminated by the manufacturing process, by the horrible location of the plant and the groundwater pollution and the air pollution and the flooding and all the awful things that are happening with climate change and where the cotton is grown. It's outsourced from other countries many times. So there's lots of stuff we still are in need of. But the menstrual movement today, if you look at the ads, I mean, they are coming around.
Does anyone have a Tampax? I do. Pick a size, any size. Your flow changes every day. That's why we've got you covered with 5 different absorbencies.
They realize consumers and the wallets count. So there's been a greening, if you will, of the industry. Pads, too. And they're getting competition for menstrual cups, menstrual discs, which really can contain much more menstrual flow, which is kind of worrisome to me. So they want to be kind of like the good guys. They want to align themselves more with the healthy, strong approach to menstruation. There's been a revolution. I mean, it's fascinating to see, at least in the last decade, that is coming about. And it's not because they've seen the light. It's because, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. I mean, everything you can think of has been now framed in this femtech perspective.
Here's a really stupid question. Why?
How can you say that?
Why can't we use something other than a synthetic vagina? I mean, why can't something else be standardized? Like, what would it take for us to update this process and use something much more like a real vagina? Or, with the kind of innovation that we have in femtech now, I would imagine that somebody would say, oh, that's dumb that we're still using a syngina. We have all this technology. Let's use a new thing. And here's a new device. And what's stopping that from happening, Nancy?
The real reason is because menstruation is still considered like the bottom of the barrel and not exactly the hot part of science to be involved in. Having said that, what is hot right now are organs on a chip.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that term?
Yes.
So we can create livers and brains and hearts on this infrastructure. There's an ovary on a chip. I don't know if there's a vagina on a chip. It might all be one big organ now. That's where this science is going. That's the big science, if you will. So the syngina, the 8th grade science project as we know it, is probably going to go away because we will be able to replicate menstruation in the laboratory in these artificial organs. And it may already be happening, and I'm just not aware of it, but that's exactly what's going to be happening.
I want to draw us to a close by asking you, what do you want to say to young women today who are just starting to use menstrual products? What do you want to say to them as they think about, well, how do I keep myself safe and healthy as a consumer of menstrual products?
Well, thankfully, there are guidelines, and that's what we need to know, especially the young girls. I have a 12-year-old granddaughter, and she hasn't started to menstruate yet. But every time she comes down with the flu, and it's rampant every winter, I worry about that. And moms need to worry about it too. Even in the young adolescents, because of this fear of shame and social stigma associated with menstruation, and they're going to leak, that they are using tampons versus pads. And a much better approach would be to at least alternate. And that's what the recommendation is by the FDA. Alternate the use of tampons and pads. Wash your hands before you change your tampon. Menstrual cups also, they say just rinse them out and put them back in. No, the new recommendation is to boil them between uses because they're seeing this increased incidence. Don't wear them at night. More than 8 hours is the maximum. So there is this trajectory of research that is starting way back because of toxic shock.
Nancy, thank you so much for this. This was a completely fascinating conversation, and I hope listeners got as much from it as I have. So thanks for joining me on Overlooked.
You're so welcome. It was a pleasure.
Overlooked is here for information and empowerment, but not medical advice. Every person's body is unique. So if you have questions, it is best to speak to your doctor or healthcare provider. We're building a community around women's health so that no one is overlooked. If you'd like to be part of it, hit the follow button on this podcast, wherever you're listening to this. Or you can show us some love by writing us a review and sharing this episode with someone. Overlooked is written and created by me, Golda Arthur. Jessica Martinez de Hoz is the show's producer. You can stay up to date with the show by signing up for the newsletter and following us on Instagram and LinkedIn. We read every review and email, so write to us, hello@overlookedpod.com. Thanks for listening.